I was watching Bill Maher talk about the Palestinian Likud issue, and his arguments are so obviously rebuttable. It's just unbelievably immoral how so many people have allowed him to get away with it. Number one, he keeps talking about the Hezbollah and Hamas and possibly the PA, intending to kill civilians. And again, that's a distinction without a difference. Because when you look at the number of civilians that have been killed, or innocent civilians, or displaced, we're dealing with a factor of 10 to 100 times more. And that tells you, again, that this, we're just dealing with semantics. Because to the extent that the IDF cared more about civilians, those numbers, that the gap between the number of deaths would be quite small, or at least smaller. And yet, when you're dealing with that much of a discrepancy, again, you're dealing with a distinction without a difference. But more than that, the IDF does not believes in collective punishment. Under the laws of Likud, the IDF, for example, number one, will raise the house, destroy the house of anybody in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, where an inhabitant inside that property has committed terrorism. And so, again, that's supposed to be a deterrent. That is something that, is quite common in criminal law, and obviously doesn't work. And so that's one of the reasons why we don't do that in the United States, or we haven't done that so far in the United States, because up until now, we believed more in the individual. We've said that we're a country of freedom and individuals, and the individual must be protected against the tyranny of people who are more powerful than them. And that's not the case under Likud. They definitely believe in collective punishment. But more than that, the number of individuals that have been killed, innocent people, a number of protesters, journalists. You're looking at, go all the way back to Rachel Corrie. You look at the people today. There was a Palestinian Americans. There's a Turkish American that was recently killed. So you're dealing with not only a massive difference in body count, that you're dealing with that, which eliminates this whole idea of, is it gross negligence? Is it intent? Is it voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, and so on and so forth? You're dealing with legalese that doesn't really apply in this type of forum when you're dealing with these kinds of weapons and this kind of occupation, essentially, that forces a mass density of people in one place who can't leave. So let's talk about that. People in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip don't have freedom of movement. Their electricity, their water, it's all controlled by at this point, by Likud. So, just let's go ahead and put the shoe on the other foot. Let's say you're Bill Maher and you have a bunch of protesters with machine guns who come in and say that we think, we knock on his door and said, you can't leave. We think that there's somebody on this block who is a terrorist, and in order for your safety and ours, right, we need to make sure you stay inside, and you can't come out unless we tell you to, and if you do come out, you're going to go through our checkpoints. And, Bill Maher is not going to put up with this, right? He's going to go inside, he's going to call his friends. Well, first of all, he's going to check to see if his gun is bigger than his opposition's, right? And if it's not, then he's going to call his friends, right? To try to supply him with some weapons that allow him to leave, or at least have some measure of self-determination. So the first thing he's going to do is build a tunnel to try to get weapons into his house so that he can, leave, and try to get people into his house so that he can actually leave and have some sort of self-determination. If that doesn't work, he's going to call his neighbors. Maybe he calls, a guy called Lebanon or Syria and says, help me out. I'm being unjustly detained. I'm being unjustly persecuted here. Do something about it. And that, of course, depending on the kind of weapons that his friends have or his neighbors have, could create, a huge escalation. And so we know this dynamic would happen because there was a protest, Black Lives Matter, and this white couple somewhere, all that happened was a bunch of protesters went by this big house, and they basically walked out. One of them walked out with what looked like a machine gun of some sort in order to intimidate. They didn't shoot it, but they, obviously wanted to intimidate the protesters who were just walking by on the sidewalk past their house. And so we know this dynamic applies when you believe that you are entitled to be where you are. And that's one of the reasons why you have this sort of idea, this propaganda that, quote unquote, Palestine is not a state, so and so, right? That's why you have that propaganda, because you're trying to, remove the idea of legitimacy from the people who are there today. You're trying to dehumanize them. So we know, number one, again, above all, that what the Palestinians are doing today is exactly what Bill Maher would be doing were he in their shoes. So what is it that makes Bill Maher incapable of seeing himself in the Palestinians? Two human beings that would most likely be doing similar things under the same or similar conditions. It's because look where he is. He's in the United States. How did the United States come to be? It displaced the Native Americans, it killed them, and it took their land. So you're looking at a similarity that if it's looked upon too closely, starts to erode the morality of the United States. And it starts to also, once you start looking at it from that viewpoint, it starts to open doors into areas that would delegitimize the entire country. So for example, once you start looking at the fact that Bill Maher is only in the United States because of another group of people that was displaced and killed, you start looking at, wait a second, why does the Catholic Church own, which is politically connected, majority on the Supreme Court, White House, and so on and so forth, why does it own so much property that it doesn't pay taxes on, especially in California? So the reason that we don't go all the way that far back is because, despite the fact that we've also dropped, bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is because of the idea that the Americans believe in principles that we fight for and defend, primarily the power and safety of the individual, despite that individual's differences in religion, race, ancestry, and so on. And that we've come a long way since we've displaced and killed these, the Native Americans. But if you look at what's happening in Palestine, and you look at the political establishment, it starts to look more and more like we haven't come a long way. And remember, this is their language, right? Not mine. I'm an immigrant. I have nothing to do with this history in the United States, despite the fact that I'm an American. So you start to look more and more at this idea that the so-called American exceptionalism, which is based on this idea of being defenders of individual liberty, is not actually true. And if it's not true, then who really are the quote-unquote savages? Who really needs to be civilized? And once you start looking at that paradigm differently, everything looks suspect. Why are houses worth so much more in this country versus another country, to the extent that the country in which the houses are worth more doesn't have, ironclad principles? Why is this debt something that we believe will be paid back, or that is justified, right? To the extent that the people involved who are holding the debt, the banks who are affiliated with the military, who are getting a lot of this debt, why is it that we think that debt and that house deserves to be worth more than somebody's shack somewhere else that does believe and has a government or a local council that believes, in individual liberty? And remember, the United States was all about being anti-communist, right? Communist, right? It's all about how the United States was always saying that we are anti-communist because we believe in the power of the individual. We don't believe in collective punishment. We don't believe we believe in due process and so on and so forth. And even in the United States, that's becoming, more and more suspect. When a mass shooter has committed a crime, in some cases, depending on where they are, the local DA has charged a parent in that house with a similar crime. And I'm completely opposed to it, usually, unless, of course, there's a lot of evidence that justifies it, because, you're dealing with, again, a slippery slope into collective punishment. And so overall, we're dealing with a reckoning. We're dealing with a moral reckoning within the United States that the Palestinian issue has become a litmus test of. Are we a moral country that deserves to be unequal, that deserves to create inequality in other countries based on the power of our currency and the power of our military? Or are we as rapacious and as immoral as the British Empire or as, other countries that have had empires in the past?